My beloved child, listen closely, because something shifted in a way your soulmate did not expect, and the strange part is not simply what the third party chose to do, it is what your soulmate realized in the quiet moments immediately afterward. There was a point when they thought they understood the situation, when they believed they could keep everything calm by saying less, waiting longer, and allowing certain conversations to disappear on their own. But today, one small action disturbed that fragile silence. The third party brought something forward that had been sitting beneath the surface for longer than anyone wanted to admit. It may have been a message repeated without its full context, a private conversation brought into the open, or a carefully chosen sentence meant to make your soulmate question what they already knew about you. And for a moment, it worked, not because your soulmate suddenly doubted you, but because they were caught off guard by how deliberately the situation had been shaped around them. That distinction matters. Don't skip, because what happened next is where the meaning begins to change. Instead of reacting immediately, your soulmate became unusually quiet. They looked at the words again. They replayed the conversation. They remembered details the third party probably assumed had been forgotten. And somewhere inside that silence, a question appeared that they could no longer push away. Why did every attempt to create distance somehow keep bringing their thoughts back to you? That question did not arrive dramatically. It came softly, almost inconveniently, while they were trying to make sense of everything else. Your soulmate began noticing something they had previously overlooked. The story they were being given did not completely match the person they had experienced you to be. Certain details felt stretched. Certain intentions seemed assigned to you without anyone actually asking what you felt. And that is when their attention shifted from the third party's words to their own memories. They remembered the way you handled moments when you could have made things difficult but chose restraint instead. They remembered things you never demanded recognition for. They remembered a particular feeling around you that was difficult to explain because it was never about perfection, it was about sincerity. And suddenly the shocking thing the third party had done was no longer the center of your soulmate's mind. You were. Something important is waiting for you in this realization, because your soulmate did not simply think, maybe I misunderstood. Their thoughts went deeper. They began wondering how many decisions they had made while listening to everyone except the one person whose truth mattered most. Imagine that quiet realization for a moment. Not guilt. Not panic. Just the uncomfortable clarity of recognizing that outside voices may have been occupying space where an honest conversation should have been. Your soulmate could feel the difference. And once they noticed it, they could not easily return to the old way of thinking. There is another detail, though, and this is where the story becomes far more personal than it first appears. The third party expected a reaction. Perhaps they expected your soulmate to become colder, more distant, more certain that walking away from the connection was the easiest choice. Instead, your soulmate asked a question the third party was not prepared for. It was simple. Almost too simple. Something like, "How do you know that?" And the answer did not bring the certainty your soulmate expected. There was hesitation. A detail changed. A reason became less clear. And your soulmate noticed. That tiny inconsistency opened a door much larger than the conversation itself. Suddenly they were no longer listening passively. They were examining everything. Not with anger, but with a new awareness. Why had they accepted certain assumptions so quickly? Why had they let someone else explain your intentions? Why did the possibility of losing contact with you feel heavier now than it did before? Stay till the end, because that last question is the one your soulmate could not escape. They tried returning to ordinary things afterward. They checked their phone. They moved around the room. They distracted themselves with something familiar. But your name kept returning, not because someone was mentioning you, but because their own mind was finally connecting pieces it had kept separate. They remembered a conversation that ended too soon. They remembered something they wanted to tell you but decided against. They remembered how many times they almost reached out and then convinced themselves that silence was safer. And now, after what the third party had done, silence no longer felt safe. It felt unfinished. That is why the words, "needs you now," carry a quieter meaning than you might expect. This is not about rescuing anyone. It is not about dropping everything or proving yourself. Your soulmate does not need a dramatic gesture. What they are beginning to need is the possibility of something genuine, the kind of conversation where no third person interprets your feelings, where no assumptions fill the spaces between sentences, where two people are finally allowed to hear each other clearly. There is something deeply human about that need. Sometimes people do not understand the value of direct communication until they see how easily a connection can become distorted without it. And your soulmate may be standing at exactly that realization. Then came the moment no one else saw. Your soulmate picked up their phone and opened the place where your name still existed. Perhaps it was an old conversation. Perhaps your profile. Perhaps a message they had read more times than they would ever admit. Their thumb hovered there for longer than expected. They did not type immediately. They simply looked. And something about that stillness said more than a rushed message could have said. Because beneath all their confusion was a truth they were finally willing to examine: they still cared what you thought. They still cared how you were doing. They still cared whether the distance between you was based on reality or on assumptions that had grown too large. And once someone begins asking that question sincerely, the entire emotional landscape changes. Here is what makes this different from the previous times your soulmate thought about reaching out. Earlier, they were mostly thinking about what could go wrong. What if the conversation became awkward? What if too much time had passed? What if you misunderstood why they were contacting you? But now another question is becoming stronger than all of those. What if staying silent creates the very ending they never truly wanted? That thought stayed with them. It followed them into the next hour. It softened some of their defensiveness. It made them reconsider moments they once labeled too quickly. And for the first time in a while, your soulmate was not trying to decide who was right. They were trying to understand what was real. There is a difference, and it changes everything. The third party may have intended to influence the direction of this connection, yet their action unexpectedly forced your soulmate to stop avoiding the one conversation they had been postponing inside themselves. They began separating facts from interpretations. They began recognizing where fear of misunderstanding had been mistaken for certainty. They began remembering your actual behavior instead of someone else's description of it. And the more they did this, the quieter the outside noise became. But there is one specific memory that affected them more than the others. It was not the most romantic memory. It was not something dramatic. It was a moment when you were simply yourself. Maybe you listened without interrupting. Maybe you gave them space when they needed it. Maybe you said something ordinary that later became meaningful because it showed them how carefully you had understood what they were feeling. Your soulmate remembered that moment today, and suddenly something clicked. People can imitate words. They can repeat stories. They can form opinions. But the feeling of being genuinely understood is much harder to manufacture. Your soulmate knew what that felt like with you. And realizing that made the third party's version of you feel less convincing. The most unexpected shift came afterward. Your soulmate stopped asking, "What does everyone think I should do?" and began asking, "What do I actually want?" That question may sound simple, but it can be life-changing when someone has spent too long adjusting themselves around other people's expectations. Their answer did not arrive all at once. First came your name. Then came the desire for clarity. Then came a quiet wish that there might still be a way to speak without carrying every old misunderstanding into the conversation. And finally came something even more vulnerable. They wondered whether you would still recognize the version of them that is trying to become more honest now. That is the part no third party can decide for them. No one else can choose whether they speak. No one else can tell them what they truly feel. And no one else can create the courage required to be sincere. Your soulmate has to reach that point on their own. Yet something about today moved them closer. The third party's action may have looked like another complication, but your soulmate is beginning to see it as a moment that revealed where the real problem had been, not simply between people, but between truth and assumption. Notice what is happening here. The biggest change is not that your soulmate suddenly knows exactly what to do. The biggest change is that they no longer feel comfortable pretending nothing needs to be said. That is a far more meaningful turning point. Because action usually begins quietly, with a person becoming unable to ignore what their own heart has been repeating. Your soulmate is getting closer to that place. And there is a sentence forming inside them now, one they have rewritten mentally more than once. It does not begin with blame. It does not begin with excuses. It begins with honesty. Something like, "There's something I should have asked you directly a long time ago." Just imagine the weight inside those words. They carry everything your soulmate avoided, everything others interpreted, everything time left unresolved. Yet they also carry possibility. Not a guarantee. Not a perfect ending. Just the possibility that two people could finally speak without allowing anyone else to stand between what they mean and what the other person hears. And perhaps that is why this moment feels different. Your soulmate is no longer searching for someone to confirm what they should believe about you. They are beginning to want the answer from you. But there is one more piece they discovered after the third party's surprising move, and this piece changed their understanding more than anything else. It involved something that had been said about your intentions, something your soulmate had quietly believed for longer than you might imagine. Today, they found a reason to question it. And once they did, they went back further, looking at an old exchange from a completely different perspective. What they noticed there made them stop. Because hidden inside something they once dismissed was a clue that you may have been trying to tell them the truth all along, and in the next moment, your soulmate realized exactly what they had misunderstood. And then something unexpectedly simple made the entire story look different. Your soulmate went back to a moment they had almost forgotten, a conversation that seemed ordinary at the time, the kind of exchange a person reads once and moves past without realizing how much meaning was hidden inside it. But now, with everything that had happened, they saw your words differently. There was no manipulation in them. No attempt to force an outcome. No hidden demand. You had simply been trying to explain something honestly, and because your soulmate had already been influenced by assumptions around them, they had interpreted your sincerity through the wrong lens. That realization stayed with them. They read the exchange again, slower this time, noticing where you had given them room instead of pressure, where you had left the door open instead of pulling them through it, and where you had quietly tried to communicate that you cared without asking them to immediately give you something in return. Suddenly, one uncomfortable question rose inside them: what if I judged that moment without really understanding it? Don't skip, because this is where the third party's action begins producing the exact opposite effect from what they may have expected. Your soulmate did not become more certain about walking away. They became more curious about what they had missed. And curiosity, when it is honest, has a way of loosening conclusions that once seemed permanent. They started remembering details that never completely fit the story they had been told about you. If you truly wanted to control them, why had you respected their space? If you were indifferent, why had certain small moments carried so much care? If the connection meant nothing, why did your absence still feel noticeable in places where no one else could see? Your soulmate was not romanticizing the past. They were doing something more grounded than that. They were comparing what people said about you with what they had personally experienced. And for the first time, those two versions were no longer blending together. One felt louder. The other felt truer. That difference became impossible to ignore. A few minutes later, another memory surfaced, one that involved the third party directly. It was a sentence spoken casually months ago, perhaps framed as advice, perhaps disguised as concern. At the time, your soulmate had accepted it because the person saying it sounded certain. But today, after seeing one detail change and another explanation become less consistent, your soulmate remembered that old sentence and wondered why it had been delivered with so much confidence. That was when they noticed a pattern. Not something dramatic. Something subtler. Whenever your soulmate seemed ready to understand you more deeply, another interpretation appeared. Whenever they considered speaking directly to you, some new reason to hesitate somehow entered the conversation. Whenever they remembered something good about you, they were quickly reminded of what supposedly could go wrong. For a long time, your soulmate saw these moments individually. Today, they started seeing them together. And that changed everything. Stay till the end, because the most important discovery was not about what the third party said. It was about what your soulmate had stopped asking. They realized they had stopped asking themselves whether those outside opinions actually matched their own experience. Somewhere along the way, caution had quietly become distance, and distance had quietly become a story that neither of you had been given the chance to correct. Your soulmate sat with that realization longer than expected. They did not rush to defend themselves. They did not immediately blame anyone. Instead, they felt something softer and more difficult to avoid: regret for the conversations they never allowed to happen. Not regret that erased the past, but the kind that makes a person want to do better with the next opportunity. Their mind returned to your name again. This time, however, it was not accompanied by confusion. It was accompanied by a sentence, "should have asked you." Those 5 words became the emotional center of everything. I should have asked you what you meant. I should have asked you what happened. I should have asked you how you felt. I should have asked you instead of letting silence answer for you. And once that sentence began repeating inside your soulmate, something else changed. They stopped seeing communication with you as a risk and started seeing it as the only honest way to find clarity. There is something important waiting for you here, because what your soulmate needs now is not perfection from you. They are not expecting some magical explanation that fixes every misunderstanding in one conversation. What they are beginning to value is something much more realistic, truth spoken without performance. They want to understand what happened from your side. They want to hear the things they never gave you enough space to explain. They want to know whether certain moments meant what they thought they meant or whether the distance between you grew partly because both of you were trying to protect yourselves from saying too much. That thought softened them. They imagined what a real conversation might sound like. Not a dramatic confrontation. Not an emotional test. Just 2 people finally removing the voices that had been standing around the connection and speaking plainly. This is what I thought. This is what I felt. This is what I misunderstood. This is what I wish I had said sooner. And for the first time, that possibility did not feel overwhelming. It felt relieving. But then something happened that surprised even your soulmate. Their phone lit up. Nothing extraordinary appeared on the screen, yet seeing it made them realize how many times they had secretly hoped your name would be there. They had never admitted that fully, perhaps even to themselves. They had trained themselves to act unaffected, to believe they had moved beyond the need for answers. Yet when the screen appeared, their first instinct was still to look for you. That tiny reaction told them more than hours of overthinking had. Feelings sometimes reveal themselves through the smallest habits. The person we say we are finished thinking about is often the first name we notice in a room, the first profile our eyes pause on, the first memory that returns when life becomes quiet. Your soulmate recognized that today. And rather than pushing it away again, they allowed themselves to ask why. The answer was not simply, because I miss them. It was deeper. They missed the version of themselves that felt understood around you. They missed conversations that did not require constant explanation. They missed the possibility of something meaningful that never had enough room to fully become what it might have been. And underneath all of that was one realization they had avoided: they had never actually stopped caring. They had only become better at distracting themselves from it. Meanwhile, the third party could sense something had changed. Your soulmate's questions became more precise. Their responses became less automatic. When another opinion about you was offered, your soulmate did not immediately agree. They paused. And that pause mattered. It meant they were thinking independently again. The third party may have expected their shocking action to settle the matter, but instead it introduced doubt into a story that had once seemed unquestioned. Your soulmate began saying things like, "That's not exactly how I remember it," or, "I need to think about this myself." Quiet sentences. Powerful boundaries. They did not create a scene. They simply reclaimed the right to interpret their own experience. And once that began, the emotional distance between your soulmate and outside influence grew wider. Something else followed almost immediately. Your soulmate remembered a time when you defended them without making a big display of it. Maybe someone misunderstood them. Maybe they were struggling privately. Maybe you noticed something others missed. You did not turn it into a performance. You simply responded with kindness. Today, that memory stood beside the third party's behavior in sharp contrast. One person had been trying to tell your soulmate what to think. You, in that remembered moment, had allowed them to simply be themselves. That difference reached them deeply. It made them wonder whether they had mistaken quiet love for uncertainty and loud opinion for truth. That question stayed with them because it touched something they had been learning about themselves. Your soulmate has spent a lot of time believing that certainty always arrives loudly. But some of the most meaningful truths in life arrive gently. They do not demand attention. They wait until we are ready to recognize them. Your presence may have been one of those truths. Not perfect. Not effortless. But real enough that even distance could not erase the emotional imprint completely. Now your soulmate was looking at that imprint again. They were remembering how certain conversations with you stayed in their mind long after they ended. They remembered an expression on your face, a tone in your voice, a moment when you understood something they had not fully explained. These were not grand declarations. That is exactly why they mattered. They felt genuine. And genuineness became incredibly important after today. Then the third party made another small mistake. They tried to explain what you were supposedly thinking. That sentence immediately caught your soulmate's attention. How would you know what they're thinking? The question appeared inside them before they even said anything aloud. It was so obvious that they almost wondered why they had never asked it sooner. How could anyone else confidently describe your intentions without being inside your heart? How could someone else speak on your behalf when the simplest solution had always been to speak with you directly? Suddenly, the entire situation felt unnecessarily complicated. Your soulmate saw how easily assumptions had been layered on top of assumptions until the original connection was almost buried beneath them. And beneath all those layers was something surprisingly simple: two people who had never fully finished the conversation. That realization brought your soulmate closer to action. They opened the message window again. This time they typed a few words. Then deleted them. They tried again. Deleted those too. It was not because they did not want to reach out. It was because they wanted the first sentence to carry the right intention. They did not want to arrive defensively. They did not want to make you responsible for repairing everything. They wanted to come honestly. That hesitation revealed growth. In the past, they may have waited for certainty before communicating. Now they were beginning to understand that clarity sometimes comes through communication itself. You do not always know exactly where a conversation will lead before you begin it. Sometimes you simply know that silence is no longer giving you the answers you need. Your soulmate had reached that point. Yet another thought stopped them just before sending anything: what if you have changed? It was not a fearful thought. It was almost tender. They wondered whether time had made you stronger, calmer, less willing to accept confusion. They wondered whether you had learned things during the distance that they had not been present to witness. And strangely, rather than making them pull away, that possibility made them want to know you again. Not the version of you frozen inside an old memory. The person you are now. That is where the emotional direction begins shifting completely. Your soulmate is no longer only looking backward. They are wondering whether there could be a new kind of connection ahead, one built with clearer communication, stronger boundaries, and less interference from people who are not actually living the relationship themselves. It does not mean every question disappears. It means the questions become healthier. Instead of, "What will everyone think?" the question becomes, "What feels honest?" Instead of, "What if something goes wrong?" it becomes, "What if we finally understand each other?" Instead of, "Who should I listen to?" it becomes, "Why haven't I listened to the person directly involved?" Those questions open something inside them. And then, almost without warning, one specific detail from today returned to their mind. It was something the third party said while trying to justify what they had done. A phrase that sounded insignificant at first. Your soulmate had barely reacted when they heard it. But hours later, the wording began bothering them. The phrase revealed something. It suggested the third party knew about a private detail they should not have known, or at least knew far more than your soulmate had realized. That was when your soulmate stopped thinking only about today and began tracing the situation backward. When had that information first been shared? Who had access to it? Why had certain misunderstandings appeared shortly afterward? The answers were not complete yet, but enough pieces were lining up to make your soulmate realize that this connection had been influenced more than they previously understood. Still, instead of becoming angry, they became clearer. They knew what they did not want anymore. They did not want relationships managed through second-hand information. They did not want private feelings turned into public discussion. They did not want to make important emotional choices because someone else sounded convincing. And most importantly, they did not want another meaningful connection to become a casualty of silence. That boundary formed quietly but firmly. Something inside your soulmate had matured. They could finally see that protecting a connection does not mean hiding it from reality. It means giving it enough honesty to survive reality. That means asking difficult questions. Listening without preparing a defense. Admitting when assumptions were wrong. Allowing another person to tell their own story instead of accepting someone else's version of it. Your soulmate was beginning to understand all of that at once. And that is why their need for you now feels different from simple longing. They need truth. They need directness. They need the missing part of the story that only you can provide. Not because you owe them an explanation, but because they finally recognize that they should have created space for your voice much sooner. Late that evening, your soulmate returned once more to the conversation with your name. This time they did not scroll through everything. They stopped at one message. A message you probably never imagined would matter this much. It contained a sentence that seemed almost ordinary when you sent it, but today your soulmate understood what was underneath it. You had been giving them a choice. You had been saying, in your own way, "I care, but I will not force you." And your soulmate finally understood the strength inside that. Real care had not been chasing them. It had been leaving room for them to choose freely. That realization touched something deep because they suddenly saw the difference between being influenced and being loved. Influence says, here is what you should think. Love says, I trust you to discover what is true. Your soulmate sat there quietly, staring at that message, and for perhaps the first time, they recognized what you had actually been offering them. Not pressure. Space. Not control. Choice. And that was exactly what the third party had unknowingly taken away by trying to shape the situation. Now your soulmate wanted it back. Their own choice. Their own voice. Their own understanding of you. And this is where the next chapter begins, because just as they were about to close the conversation and wait until they could find the right words, another detail appeared, something connected to the third party's actions that your soulmate had completely overlooked earlier. It was small enough that anyone else might have dismissed it. But your soulmate recognized it immediately. And the moment they understood what it meant, they stopped deleting the message they had been trying to write to you. The detail was sitting there in plain sight, and somehow that made it even harder to ignore. Your soulmate looked at it twice, then a third time, because the first reaction was disbelief, not dramatic disbelief, but that quiet moment when the mind realizes it has been arranging a story around the wrong assumption. It was connected to timing. Something the third party had claimed happened one way did not match when the message had actually been sent, when the conversation had actually taken place, or when your soulmate remembered hearing about it. The difference may have seemed small to anyone else, but to them it changed the shape of everything. Suddenly, one question became impossible to put down: if this part was misunderstood, what else had been misunderstood too? They did not rush toward an answer. They simply sat with it, allowing the uncertainty to become useful instead of frightening. That was new. In the past, uncertainty made them retreat. Tonight, it made them curious. They opened the message box again. The words came slowly at first. I think there's something we never really talked about. They stared at the sentence. It felt too formal. They erased it. Another attempt appeared. I've been thinking about something that happened. That felt closer, but still incomplete. They deleted that too. Then they stopped trying to sound perfect. And that was the moment everything softened. Don't skip, because your soulmate's biggest shift was not finding the right sentence. It was realizing they no longer wanted to hide behind the wrong one. For so long, they had believed a meaningful conversation needed perfect timing, perfect wording, perfect emotional certainty. But life rarely gives people that kind of perfection. Sometimes the most important conversations begin with a hesitant sentence from someone who is finally willing to be real. Your soulmate understood that tonight. So they typed again, more simply this time. Can I ask you something honestly? They did not send it yet. But they did not erase it either. That mattered. Their finger rested near the screen while their mind moved through everything that had happened: the third-party surprising action, the inconsistency they noticed, the old message from you, the uncomfortable awareness that they had allowed other voices to become louder than their own experience. And then another realization arrived. They had been waiting for you to make the first move while quietly creating conditions that made it difficult for you to know whether reaching out would even be welcome. That realization humbled them. They remembered moments when you may have tried to come closer and they answered with distance because they were uncertain. They remembered times when you became quieter afterward, and they had interpreted your silence as lack of care instead of considering that perhaps you were simply respecting the boundary they had created. That possibility changed the emotional meaning of several memories at once. The absence they once used as proof that you had moved on now looked different. Maybe your quietness had not meant indifference. Maybe it meant you were unwilling to force yourself into a place where you were not sure you were wanted. Your soulmate leaned back and let that thought settle. It was uncomfortable because it removed one of the easiest explanations they had relied on. If you had simply stopped caring, then everything was easy to categorize. But if you had cared and still chosen restraint, then the distance between you carried a completely different story. Stay till the end, because the next realization was the one that made them finally stop searching for another excuse. Your soulmate asked themselves a question they had avoided for a long time: if you reached out right now, what would I actually want to say? The answer arrived almost immediately. Not, why did you leave? Not, why didn't you try harder? Not even, do you still care? The first honest thought was, I'm sorry I let other people influence something I should have understood for myself. That sentence surprised them. It was not comfortable. It asked them to take responsibility without knowing how you would respond. But there was freedom inside it too. Because responsibility meant they were no longer powerless. They could not change what had already happened, but they could choose a different way of communicating now. And your soulmate began imagining what that would look like. They imagined asking instead of assuming. They imagined listening all the way through instead of preparing a response halfway into your sentence. They imagined telling you what confused them without making you defend your entire character. They imagined being honest about the outside influence they had allowed in. And more than anything, they imagined finally giving you the chance to tell them what they never stopped long enough to hear. Something important is waiting for you here. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that reconciliation, clarity, or even simple emotional peace does not begin with proving who was right. It begins with creating a space where both people can finally tell the truth without punishment. That thought became deeply calming to them. They realized they did not have to know where the conversation would lead before beginning it. They only had to know why they wanted to begin. And the reason was becoming clear. They did not want another decision about you to be made without you. That was the boundary they had been slowly forming all evening. No more interpretations passed through other people. No more private feelings discussed as though they belonged to a group. No more treating assumptions like facts because they were repeated confidently. If something involved you, your soulmate wanted to hear your side from your own voice. That sounded obvious now, almost painfully obvious. But sometimes people learn the simplest lessons only after complicated experiences show them what happens without those lessons. Then the phone screen dimmed. Your soulmate touched it again before it went dark completely, almost instinctively protecting the unfinished message as though closing the screen might close their courage with it. They looked at the words, "Can I ask you something honestly?" The sentence was still there. Their heart was quieter now. Not fearless, but steadier. They added another line. I realized I may have misunderstood something. This time they did not delete it. And that was when another memory surfaced, a memory involving the exact issue the third party had tried to use today. Your soulmate remembered hearing you say something months ago that made little sense at the time. You had mentioned feeling as though certain things were reaching them differently than you intended. You may have said, "That's not what I meant," or perhaps, "I wish you would just ask me directly." At the time, your soulmate thought you were being defensive. Tonight, those words felt almost prophetic, not because anything supernatural had happened, but because they finally understood the frustration underneath them. You were not trying to escape accountability. You were trying to protect your own meaning from being rewritten. That realization made them close their eyes for a moment. They wondered how often you had felt unheard. They wondered whether there were times you walked away from a conversation carrying words you never got to finish. And suddenly, your soulmate's desire to speak with you became less about satisfying their curiosity and more about correcting the way they had approached the connection itself. They wanted to listen better. That was perhaps the most meaningful change of all. Because many people reach out when they want answers. Fewer reach out because they are finally ready to hear answers they may not have expected. Your soulmate was moving toward that second place. They knew you might tell them things that challenged their memory. They knew you might have boundaries now. They knew you may not respond immediately or in the way they imagined. And strangely, acknowledging that did not stop them. It made their intention cleaner. They were no longer reaching for control over the outcome. They were reaching for honesty. That difference made the message on their screen feel lighter. Then came another unexpected thought. What if the third party had not been the entire problem? Your soulmate recognized that it would be easy to place every misunderstanding at someone else's feet, but that would prevent them from seeing their own role. The third party may have influenced the situation, but your soulmate had still chosen which voices to trust, which questions not to ask, and which silences to maintain. Recognizing this did not make them ashamed. It made them more mature. They saw that growth required something more difficult than blaming someone else. It required admitting where they had surrendered their own judgment. That realization changed the emotional temperature of everything. Suddenly, they were less interested in confronting the third party and more interested in changing the way they handled relationships going forward. They did not need a dramatic argument. They needed stronger boundaries. They did not need to prove that someone else was completely wrong. They needed to stop allowing other people to become translators for connections they were capable of understanding themselves. And in that moment, your soulmate made an internal decision. If your name came up again, they would not participate in speculation. If someone claimed to know your intentions, they would ask how they could possibly know. If something concerned the connection between you, they would bring it to you directly. That quiet decision felt stronger than any emotional outburst could have. It was the beginning of your soulmate reclaiming responsibility for their own heart. Yet there was still one thing holding them back from sending the message. Not pride. Not the third party. It was the possibility that they had waited too long. They wondered whether you had become peaceful without them. Whether reopening the conversation would disturb something you had worked hard to settle. That question mattered because their feelings were beginning to become less self-centered. They were not simply asking, "What do I need?" They were asking, "Would reaching out respect where you are now?" And because they cared, they hesitated. But then they remembered something else you had once shown them: respect does not mean silence when honesty is needed. Respect means giving someone the freedom to respond however they choose. Your soulmate could reach out gently without demanding an answer. They could acknowledge the past without trying to rewrite it. They could offer truth and leave you room to decide what you wanted to do with it. That understanding changed everything. It gave them a way forward that did not depend on forcing an outcome. So they edited the message one final time. Can I ask you something honestly? I realized I may have misunderstood something, and I should have asked you directly a long time ago. They read it slowly. There was no accusation. No pressure. No dramatic explanation. Just a door opened carefully. For several seconds, their thumb remained above the screen. Then they set the phone down. Not because they had changed their mind, but because something else needed to happen first. They needed to understand exactly what the third party had done today, not so they could arrive at you with a story full of blame, but so they could separate what they knew from what they had merely assumed. This time, they were determined not to repeat the same mistake. They reviewed the conversation. They replayed the details. And that was where another inconsistency appeared. The third party had described your reaction to something, but your soulmates suddenly realized they had never actually seen that reaction themselves. It had been reported to them. Secondhand. And somehow, over time, they had remembered it almost as though they had witnessed it personally. That discovery unsettled them more than the original action. It showed them how easily repetition can become memory. How a sentence heard often enough can begin to feel like lived experience even when it was never directly observed. Your soulmate began separating those things carefully. What had they actually seen from you? What had they personally heard you say? What had someone else told them? Once they made that distinction, the picture changed dramatically. Several of the strongest reasons they had used to justify distance were built on information they had never verified. That did not automatically make the information false. But it meant it had never deserved the certainty they had given it. And your soulmate finally understood that. Their emotions softened toward you even more, not because they suddenly assumed you were perfect, but because they realized fairness required giving your own voice equal weight. They thought about how they would feel if someone interpreted their private intentions for another person. They would want the chance to explain themselves too. That empathy opened another door. For the first time, your soulmate imagined the situation from your side without immediately defending their own decisions. What had it felt like when they became distant without clearly explaining why? What had it felt like if you sensed another person's influence but could not prove it without sounding defensive? What had it felt like to care about someone who seemed to be responding to a version of you that you did not recognize? The thought landed quietly. There was no need for melodrama. Simple empathy was enough. Your soulmate felt the weight of what might have been confusing for you. And then something inside them became certain, not about the future, but about the next step. They wanted to stop leaving important things unsaid. That was all. No promise beyond that. No fantasy. Just one honest conversation. Sometimes the most powerful shift is not deciding how the story ends. It is deciding that the story deserves the truth before it ends at all. Your soulmate picked up the phone again. The message waited exactly where they had left it. Their thumb moved closer to send. Then another notification appeared at the top of the screen. It came from the third party. The timing was almost strange enough to make your soulmate smile, not because anything was funny, but because the contrast was suddenly obvious. One conversation represented the old pattern: explanations, opinions, interpretations. The other represented something new: directness. Your soulmate looked at both. For the first time, they knew which one deserved their attention. They did not immediately open the third party's message. Instead, they returned to yours. That small choice carried enormous meaning. It meant your soulmate was no longer allowing every outside voice to interrupt their own clarity. They were learning that attention is a boundary too. Where we place it determines which voices grow louder inside us. And tonight, they wanted your voice to have space again. But just before they sent the message, they remembered one final detail, something the third party had said earlier that afternoon. They already know how you feel. At the time, your soulmate had accepted the statement without questioning it. Now it sounded completely different. How could anyone know what you understood about your soulmate's feelings when your soulmate had never clearly told you? That sentence exposed the heart of the entire misunderstanding. Everyone had been assuming everyone else already knew. Your soulmate assumed you knew they cared. You may have assumed their distance meant they did not. The third party assumed they understood both sides. Silence filled whatever remained. And a connection that might have been clarified through one honest conversation became surrounded by interpretations. Your soulmate stared at the message they had written and finally understood why it mattered so much. They were not simply contacting you because something shocking happened today. They were breaking a pattern. A pattern of letting silence speak for them. A pattern of allowing other people to define what they had not had the courage to say. A pattern of waiting for certainty instead of creating clarity. Their breathing slowed. Their mind became unexpectedly calm. And then, without adding another word, your soulmate pressed send. The message left the screen. There was no dramatic sound. No instant transformation. Just a tiny confirmation beneath the words showing that something had moved from thought into reality. Your soulmate looked at it for several seconds, almost surprised by how ordinary the moment appeared. Yet internally, it felt enormous. They had finally done something they had postponed again and again. They had chosen direct communication over assumption. And now came the hardest part, allowing you the freedom to respond in your own time. They placed the phone down. Picked it up again. Then laughed quietly at themselves and set it farther away. They knew they could not control what came next. Strangely, that brought peace rather than panic. Because for once, their part had been honest. They had reached out without demanding. They had opened the door without pulling you through it. They had corrected the one thing they actually had the power to correct, their own silence. Minutes passed. Then more. Your soulmate began doing something else, trying not to stare at the screen. But their mind was no longer spinning the way it had earlier. The tension had changed into anticipation, not the restless kind, but the quiet awareness that something real had finally begun moving. And then the phone lit up. Your soulmate froze for half a second before looking. Your name was there. Yet it was not the response itself that caught them first. It was the preview, the beginning of a sentence from you that immediately made them realize you had been carrying your own side of this story for far longer than they knew. Your message began with words they had never expected to read, and suddenly every conversation from today, every assumption from the past, and every reason they had been afraid to contact you seemed to narrow into one extraordinary moment. Because your first sentence did not accuse them. It did not ask where they had been. It revealed something your soulmate had never known you were waiting to say.